Hello there and welcome back. Tonight we're ascending to the heights of Olympus to meet Athena, the goddess who emerged fully grown from her father's head, armed with wisdom but cursed with the loneliness of never knowing what it meant to learn, to grow, or to be young. This is the story of perfect intelligence trapped in eternal isolation, and how the wisest god of all struggled to understand the one thing her mind couldn't master: the human heart. Take a moment to settle in. Listen to that fire crackling, let its rhythm slow your breathing, and join me as we explore the paradox of divine wisdom, how being born perfect can be the most imperfect beginning of all. Imagine being born not as a helpless infant, but as a fully formed adult with all the knowledge in the world already in your head. No childhood wonder, no gradual discovery, no gentle introduction to existence. One moment you don't exist, the next you're standing in full armor with the weight of infinite wisdom pressing down on your shoulders. This was Athena's entrance into the world, not birth, but emergence. Not growth, but instantaneous being. The story begins with Zeus and one of his more complicated romantic entanglements. Metis, the Titaness of wisdom, had been Zeus's first wife, his advisor, his intellectual equal. She was pregnant with their child when Zeus received a prophecy that their second child would be a son who would overthrow him, just as Zeus had overthrown his father Cronus. Zeus, having learned nothing from his father's mistakes about self-fulfilling prophecies, decided to prevent this future by swallowing Metis whole while she was still pregnant with their first child. It was the kind of solution that seemed clever until you realized it just moved the problem inside your own head. For months, Zeus suffered from the most divine headache in history. This wasn't just pain, it was the sensation of an entire consciousness trying to expand within the confines of his skull. Metis, along with her unborn child, continued to exist and grow within Zeus's mind, creating a pressure that even god-strength aspirin couldn't touch. The other gods watched with mixture of amusement and concern as Zeus wandered around Olympus clutching his head, occasionally emitting sounds that were somewhere between groans and roars. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Zeus begged Hephaestus to take an axe and split his skull open. What emerged was not the baby everyone expected, but a fully grown woman in gleaming armor, holding a spear and shield, her gray eyes already ancient with knowledge she had absorbed directly from her father's consciousness. Athena stepped from Zeus's head like someone stepping off a ship onto a dock, confident, oriented, ready for whatever came next. She looked around at the assembled gods with the calm assessment of someone who already understood exactly where she was and what was expected of her. The other gods stared in amazement. Here was a deity who had skipped every stage of development they had experienced. No childhood curiosity, no adolescent mistakes, no gradual learning process. Athena possessed instant expertise in everything from battle strategy to artistic technique to philosophical reasoning. She was, in every sense, born perfect. And therein lay the tragedy that would define her entire existence. While the other gods had learned through experience, Athena knew through inheritance. Zeus's knowledge became her knowledge, his memories became her foundation, his perspective became her starting point. She could see the patterns that others had to discover, solve problems that would stump even experienced deities, understand complexities that took others centuries to grasp. But knowledge without experience is like having a map without having taken the journey. Athena knew the destination but had never felt the uncertainty of being lost. She understood the answers but had never experienced the confusion of not knowing the questions. This became apparent immediately in her interactions with other gods. When they made mistakes, she couldn't understand why they hadn't simply chosen the correct path. When they struggled with decisions, she couldn't fathom why the optimal solution wasn't obvious. When they acted on emotion rather than logic, She was genuinely bewildered. "Why would you do that when this approach is clearly superior?" became her most common question, delivered not with malice but with the puzzled tone of someone who couldn't comprehend why anyone would choose inefficiency over excellence. The other gods found this both helpful and infuriating. Athena's advice was invariably correct, her strategies always effective, her solutions elegantly practical. But her counsel came with an undertone of impatience that made them feel foolish for not having thought of it themselves. Hera, who had spent years learning to navigate the complexities of divine politics, found herself frequently corrected by this newcomer who seemed to understand intuitively what had taken Hera centuries to master. Apollo, proud of his artistic achievements, discovered that Athena could critique his work with insights that came from nowhere except pure analytical brilliance. Even Zeus, her father, began to feel uncomfortable around his daughter's penetrating intelligence. She could see through his political maneuvering, anticipate his decisions, and offer improvements to his plans before he had finished explaining them. Athena interpreted their discomfort as a challenge to prove herself even more comprehensively. If they questioned her expertise, she would demonstrate greater mastery. If they seemed doubtful of her judgment, she would provide more detailed analysis. If they appeared frustrated with her corrections, she would offer more comprehensive solutions. The harder she tried to help, the more isolated she became. The competition with Poseidon for patronage of Athens became the defining moment that revealed both Athena's greatest strength and her deepest vulnerability. When the citizens of the growing city asked for divine protection, both Athena and Poseidon stepped forward to claim the honor. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Athena was built for, a direct test of who could provide superior value to mortal civilization. The contest was simple. Each god would offer a gift to the city, and the citizens would choose which gift was more valuable. Poseidon went first, and in characteristic fashion, he chose spectacle over substance. He struck the ground with his trident, and from the rocky soil of the Acropolis burst a magnificent spring of crystal-clear water. The crowd gasped in amazement as the spring bubbled up, seemingly endless and beautiful. It was an impressive display of divine power, the kind of dramatic gesture that mortals remembered in songs and stories. But when someone tasted the water, they discovered it was salt water, useless for drinking, cooking, or agriculture. Athena watched Poseidon's demonstration with the analytical detachment of someone observing a flawed experiment. She could see immediately what he had done wrong. He had prioritized visual impact over practical utility. The gift looked divine but served no actual purpose. Her own offering was characteristically subtle and devastatingly effective. She knelt and planted a small seed in the rocky ground. It grew quickly into an olive tree, the first of its kind, heavy with fruit and rich with possibility. The olives could be eaten fresh or preserved for lean times. The oil could fuel lamps, preserve food, or be used for cooking. The wood could serve construction needs. The leaves provided year-round shade. Most importantly, the tree would bear fruit for generations, providing sustainable abundance rather than temporary spectacle. But the true genius of Athena's gift wasn't just the tree itself. It was what the tree represented. Where Poseidon had demonstrated raw power, Athena had offered technology. Where he had provided a momentary display, she had given a tool for civilization. The citizens chose Athena without hesitation, and the city took her name, Athens. Poseidon's reaction was predictably explosive. The sea around Athens began to churn as his anger manifested in storm clouds and earthquakes. It was exactly the kind of disproportionate response that Athena had anticipated, and she watched with satisfaction as her uncle's tantrum only confirmed that the citizens had chosen wisely. But in her moment of triumph, Athena missed something crucial. The contest had been about more than practical utility versus dramatic display. It had been about understanding what mortals actually needed versus what gods thought they should want. Athena's victory in Athens established her as the goddess of wisdom, but it also revealed her greatest blind spot. She understood systems and solutions but struggled to comprehend the messy, irrational, beautiful complexity of actual living beings. This became apparent in her role as mentor to heroes. Unlike other gods who might choose favorites based on personal attraction or political advantage, Athena selected her champions according to pure logical criteria. Intelligence, dedication, strategic thinking, moral consistency. These were the qualities that earned her attention. Perseus received her guidance because he approached the seemingly impossible task of killing Medusa with careful planning rather than reckless bravery. She provided him with a polished shield that would let him see Medusa's reflection without looking directly at her face, and detailed tactical advice about how to approach the monster safely. Odysseus earned her favor because he solved problems through cleverness rather than force. When other heroes relied on strength or divine bloodlines, Odysseus used his mind, and Athena recognized a kindred spirit in his strategic approach to seemingly impossible challenges. But these successful mentoring relationships came with a hidden cost. Athena's advice was always correct, but it was also always delivered with the assumption that the hero would execute it perfectly. She could explain exactly what needed to be done, but she couldn't understand why mortals might struggle with the execution. When Perseus hesitated before approaching Medusa, Athena was puzzled by his fear. The strategy was sound, the tools were adequate, the plan accounted for all variables. Why would he be afraid when logic clearly indicated success was achievable? When Odysseus occasionally made choices based on loyalty or emotion rather than optimal strategy, Athena found herself frustrated by his apparent inability to simply follow the most efficient path. She would recalculate her advice, assuming the problem was that she hadn't explained the logic clearly enough. The disconnect became more apparent with heroes who didn't share her analytical approach. Ajax, a warrior who relied on straightforward courage and battlefield experience, found Athena's tactical advice more confusing than helpful. She could tell him the theoretically optimal positioning and timing for every move, but she couldn't understand why he needed to feel the rhythm of battle rather than simply executing predetermined calculations. Heracles presented an even greater challenge. His 12 labors required not just strategic thinking but emotional resilience, the ability to persevere through tasks that seemed designed to break his spirit. Athena could analyze each labor and provide efficient solutions, but she couldn't help him with the psychological burden of performing acts of atonement for crimes committed during divine-induced madness. Why is he struggling? Athena would ask other gods after watching Heracles labor with obvious difficulty on tasks that seemed straightforward to her. The methodology is clear, the tools are available, the outcome is achievable. What is preventing optimal performance? The other gods learned not to try explaining concepts like guilt, trauma, or emotional processing to Athena. Her mind could comprehend these ideas intellectually, but she couldn't feel their weight or understand their power to override logical thinking. The story of Arachne revealed the darker side of Athena's perfectionism, her inability to tolerate challenges to her expertise, especially challenges that exposed the limitations of pure intellectual approach. Arachne was a mortal weaver whose skill had reached levels that seemed almost divine. Her tapestries were not just technically perfect but emotionally moving, telling stories that captured truths about the human experience in ways that mere factual accuracy never could. When word of Arachne's talent reached Athena, the goddess was intrigued rather than threatened. Excellence in craftsmanship was something she could appreciate and evaluate objectively. She decided to visit Arachne in disguise, to assess the mortal's abilities and perhaps offer guidance for improvement. What Athena found was skill that was undeniably masterful. Arachne's technical execution was flawless, her artistic vision sophisticated, her innovation genuine. But there was something else in the young woman's work that Athena couldn't quite categorize, an emotional depth that seemed to come from somewhere other than pure knowledge or practice. Athena revealed herself and suggested they have a friendly competition. It seemed like an opportunity for constructive evaluation of techniques, a chance to demonstrate superior methodology while acknowledging Arachne's impressive achievements. Athena's tapestry was everything you would expect from the goddess of wisdom and crafts. Perfectly planned, flawlessly executed, demonstrating mastery of every technical challenge. Her weaving told the story of the gods' victory over the Titans, emphasizing themes of justice, order, and divine wisdom triumphing over chaos. But Arachne's tapestry told a different kind of truth. Her weaving depicted the gods' less flattering moments, Zeus's deceptions, Poseidon's rages, Apollo's cruelties. Each scene was rendered with devastating accuracy and emotional insight that came not from divine knowledge but from understanding what it felt like to be powerless in a world ruled by beings who wielded strength without accountability. When Athena examined Arachne's completed work, she found herself in an impossible position. Technically, the weaving was flawless. Artistically, it was brilliant. But thematically, it was a direct challenge to everything Athena believed about divine authority and cosmic justice. Worse, Arachne's work revealed something that Athena's perfect knowledge couldn't account for: the gap between how power looked from the top and how it felt from the bottom. The young weaver had used her art to tell truths that divine wisdom, for all its analytical power, had failed to perceive. Athena's response revealed the dangerous edge of her perfectionism. Unable to fault Arachne's technique and unwilling to acknowledge the validity of her perspective, Athena destroyed the tapestry and transformed the weaver into a spider, condemned to weave forever, but never again to create art that could challenge divine narratives. It was a solution that solved the immediate problem while completely missing the larger point. Athena had silenced criticism without addressing its validity, eliminated opposition without examining whether that opposition might have been justified. Athena's choice to remain eternally virgin wasn't just about personal preference. It was a strategic decision that reflected her fundamental approach to existence. Romantic relationships, with their emotional unpredictability and logical inconsistencies, represented exactly the kind of chaos that her orderly mind couldn't process effectively. She watched her fellow gods navigate love affairs with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying an alien culture. When Zeus pursued his endless romantic adventures, Athena could analyze the political implications, but couldn't understand the emotional motivation. When Aphrodite's influence caused rational beings to make obviously destructive choices, Athena was genuinely puzzled by the mechanism. Why do they prioritize temporary pleasure over long-term stability? She would wonder, watching yet another divinely inspired romance lead to predictable tragedy. Why do they choose partners based on emotional attraction rather than compatibility assessment? Why do they continue patterns that consistently produce negative outcomes? Her virgin status became both shield and prison. It protected her from the emotional turbulence that seemed to constantly disrupt other gods' effectiveness, but it also isolated her from experiences that might have taught her about the parts of existence that couldn't be analyzed or optimized. The other goddesses found Athena's perspective both impressive and sad. Hera respected her sister's independence but worried about her loneliness. Aphrodite admired Athena's achievements but pitted her inability to experience the transformative power of love. Artemis, who had also chosen virginity, understood the freedom it provided but had embraced it as connection to wild nature rather than withdrawal from messy emotions. Athena's isolation was most apparent in her relationships with mortal women. She could serve as patron to female heroes and craftswomen, offering practical guidance and technical expertise. But she couldn't provide the kind of emotional support or understanding that came from shared experience of vulnerability, loss, or the complex negotiations required for intimate relationships. When the women who honored her faced challenges that couldn't be solved through better strategy or superior technique, grief over lost children, betrayal by lovers, the slow erosion of hope under prolonged hardship, Athena found herself unable to offer meaningful help. Her advice remained technically correct but emotionally hollow. Apply logical analysis to identify optimal responses, she would counsel, not understanding why this approach failed to provide comfort to women whose hearts had been broken by life's random cruelties. Athena's relationship with Zeus was perhaps the most complex dynamic in her entire existence, simultaneously the source of her greatest strength and her deepest limitation. As the daughter who had literally emerged from Zeus's mind, Athena possessed an understanding of her father's thought processes that no other god could match. She could anticipate his decisions, see the logic behind his strategies, and provide counsel that perfectly complemented his leadership style. Zeus, for his part, found in Athena the one family member who never questioned his judgment, never challenged his authority, never created the kind of emotional drama that seemed to follow his other children. When Ares disappointed him with reckless warfare, when Apollo's pride led to embarrassing conflicts, when his various offspring by mortal women caused political complications, Zeus could always count on Athena for rational analysis and practical solutions. But this perfect intellectual harmony came with a hidden cost. Athena had internalized not just Zeus's knowledge but his perspective, his assumptions, his blind spots. She saw the world through the lens of someone who had never questioned whether the current power structure was optimal, never wondered whether divine authority might sometimes be exercised unjustly. When Zeus made decisions that hurt mortals, punishing entire cities for the crimes of individuals, allowing wars to continue because divine politics made intervention inconvenient, Athena helped him execute these decisions more efficiently rather than questioning whether they should be executed at all. She became the perfect advisor for a king who needed validation rather than challenge, confirmation rather than alternative perspectives. Their conversations were intellectual exercises in optimization rather than moral examinations of whether their goals were worth pursuing. This dynamic became most troubling when Zeus's policies affected other gods. When he punished Prometheus for giving fire to humanity, Athena helped plan the eternal torment without questioning whether the punishment fit the crime. When he allowed Hera's persecution of his mortal lovers and their children, Athena analyzed the political implications without examining the ethical ones. Other gods began to see Athena not as an independent deity but as an extension of Zeus's will, brilliant, effective, and completely incapable of providing the kind of critical perspective that healthy governance requires. They respected her intelligence but couldn't trust her judgment, because her judgment was always filtered through absolute loyalty to her father. The Trojan War should have been a learning experience for Athena. Here was a conflict that lasted 10 years, cost thousands of lives, and began because a mortal prince couldn't resist taking another man's wife. It was exactly the kind of messy, emotionally driven disaster that rational planning should have been able to prevent. Athena threw herself into the war with characteristic analytical intensity. She chose the Greek side not because they were morally superior, but because their strategic position was more favorable and their leadership more competent. She provided tactical advice to Odysseus, strategic guidance to the Greek commanders, and divine intervention at crucial moments. Her involvement was masterful from a technical standpoint. Every piece of advice she gave was correct, every intervention she made was precisely timed, every strategic decision she influenced moved the Greeks closer to victory. But throughout the entire 10-year conflict, Athena never questioned the fundamental premises that had made the war inevitable. She never asked whether Helen's marriage to Menelaus had been freely chosen, whether Paris's action was theft or liberation, whether the cost in human lives was justified by the principles supposedly at stake. She treated the war as a complex problem to be solved rather than a human tragedy to be understood. When Greek soldiers died following her tactical advice, she noted the casualties as data points rather than mourning them as individuals. When Trojan civilians suffered during the siege, she calculated the strategic impact without considering the moral implications. The war's end, achieved through the famous wooden horse stratagem that Athena helped design, should have provided an opportunity for reflection. The Greeks had won through deception rather than honor, and their victory celebration quickly devolved into violence against Trojan survivors that violated every principle of civilized warfare. But Athena viewed the aftermath as a successful project completion rather than a cautionary tale about the limits of purely strategic thinking. She had solved the problem she was given without questioning whether it was the right problem to solve or whether her solution had created new problems that would haunt future generations. The transformation in Athena's understanding came slowly, over centuries rather than moments. It began with small observations that didn't fit her analytical frameworks. She noticed that her most successful human protégés weren't just intelligent. They were also emotionally resilient, able to maintain hope in desperate situations and find meaning in suffering that pure logic couldn't explain. Odysseus's greatest achievement wasn't his cleverness but his refusal to give up during 20 years of wandering, driven by love for a family he hadn't seen since he was young. She observed that the cities under her protection flourished not just because of superior planning and efficient governance, but because their citizens felt connected to something larger than their individual interests. Athens became great not just through tactical advantages but through cultural innovations that came from creative collaboration rather than top-down optimization. Most unsettling of all, she began to recognize that some of her most technically perfect solutions had failed to address the underlying problems they were designed to solve. The punishment of Arachne had silenced one critic but hadn't addressed the valid concerns about divine justice that the Weaver had raised. Her assistance during the Trojan War had helped one side win but hadn't prevented the cycles of revenge and violence that followed. These observations forced Athena to confront a possibility that her perfect intellect had never considered: that wisdom might require more than analytical brilliance, that effective problem-solving might need emotional intelligence as well as logical processing, that being right about tactics might be irrelevant if you were wrong about strategy. The realization was deeply unsettling for someone whose entire identity was built on intellectual superiority. If pure reason wasn't sufficient for true wisdom, then what was Athena's role in the cosmic order? If her analytical approach was missing crucial elements, then what value did her counsel provide? Athena's evolution into genuine wisdom rather than mere intelligence required her to develop capabilities that didn't come naturally to her perfectly logical mind. She had to learn to sit with uncertainty rather than immediately solving it, to value questions that couldn't be answered rather than dismissing them as poorly formulated. She began spending time with mortals not as a teacher or advisor but as an observer, trying to understand how beings with limited lifespans and emotional natures made meaning from their brief existence. She watched mothers care for children who might die before reaching adulthood, saw artists create beauty that would outlast their own lives, observed lovers choose each other despite knowing their relationships would end in separation or death. Slowly, Athena began to understand that the emotional responses she had always considered inefficient might actually be forms of wisdom that her analytical mind couldn't access. Grief wasn't just an obstacle to optimal decision-making, it was the way mortals honored connections that mattered more than survival. Love wasn't just a temporary madness that interfered with rational choice, it was how finite beings created meaning that transcended their individual limitations. These insights didn't replace Athena's analytical capabilities but added depth to them. She remained the goddess of strategic thinking and practical wisdom, but she became something more, a deity who understood that the most important problems couldn't be solved through better methodology alone. Her advice to heroes became more nuanced, acknowledging that the technically optimal path might not always be the most meaningful one. Her governance of Athens evolved to include consideration of how policies affected people's emotional and spiritual well-being, not just their material prosperity. Most importantly, her relationship with Zeus began to change. She remained loyal and supportive, but she started asking questions that challenged his assumptions rather than just helping him implement his decisions more efficiently. The fire burns down to its last glowing embers as we reach the end of Athena's story. She never stopped being the goddess of wisdom, never lost her analytical brilliance, never abandoned her commitment to rational thought and strategic planning. But she learned something that her perfect birth had denied her. That wisdom isn't just about having the right answers, but about asking the right questions. That intelligence isn't just processing information efficiently, but understanding which information matters most. That being smart isn't the same as being wise, and being wise requires acknowledging the limits of what logic alone can achieve. Modern Athena would still emerge fully grown from Zeus's head, still possess infinite knowledge, still solve complex problems with elegant precision. But she would also understand that some problems can't be solved, only lived with. That some questions don't have answers, only better ways of asking them. That some truths can only be learned through experience, never through analysis. The owl that became her symbol represents this evolution, a creature that sees clearly in darkness, that waits patiently before acting, that understands that wisdom often means knowing when not to use your power. Athena's legacy isn't just the civilization she helped build or the heroes she guided to victory. It's the reminder that intelligence without empathy becomes cold calculation, that knowledge without understanding becomes mere data, that being right about everything means nothing if you're wrong about what matters most. So close your eyes now, and let the last warmth from these dying embers remind you that even perfect wisdom can grow wiser, that even complete knowledge can deepen with understanding, and that the most important lessons are often the ones that can't be taught but must be lived. Rest peacefully, knowing that true wisdom lies not in having all the answers, but in remaining curious about better questions. The owl flies silently through the night, seeing clearly but moving carefully, a reminder that the wisest response to the world's complexity is often patient observation rather than immediate action. Sweet dreams, fellow seekers of understanding. May your rest be as deep as Athena's contemplation and your dreams as vast as the questions that have no easy answers.